1928, Dorset, England. On that sun-drenched summer evening, the Caldwell estate gleamed with festivity, gardens overflowing with blooms, and the scent of freshly baked pastries mingling with the soft perfume of champagne. The wedding hall, adorned with silk drapes and crystal chandeliers, reflected the golden light, casting a warm glow over the gathered guests. Laughter and music intertwined as Henry Caldwell, the groom, lifted his glass in a heartfelt toast, promising love, loyalty, and a life shared with his bride. But mere moments later, that promise fractured. Henry slumped, the glass clattering against the polished floor, a sudden pall descending over the room. Musicians faltered, some witnesses swore a shadow flickered unnaturally across the walls, vanishing as if it had never been. A chill swept the room despite the summer warmth, and several claimed to hear a whispering voice echoing along the rafters, entwining itself with the orchestra's final chords. Doctors quickly arrived, diagnosing collapse or cardiac arrest, yet rumors spread. Could it have been poison, an undetected heart condition, or perhaps something more sinister, entwined with the Caldwell family's dark history? Diaries discovered in the years after the tragedy hinted at envy and obsession, rivalries hidden behind smiles and polite conversation. Letters between relatives suggested long-held grudges, secretive pacts, and murmurs of rituals performed to bless or curse the family line. Psychologists today debate the effect of high emotion gatherings on collective perception, noting how grief, shock, and tension can warp memory. Others, particularly occult researchers, trace the events to old family rites, cryptic protective charms, and whispers of ancestral curses meant to secure inheritance or control the fate of heirs. The juxtaposition of celebration and sudden death formed a surreal tableau, one that blurred the line between innocence and malevolence, joy and terror. Guests' recollections are inconsistent. Some describe Henry's final smile, others a look of horror frozen on his face. Music that once symbolized union and love became a spectral refrain, replayed in memories, letters, and haunting stories that emerged in the years following the wedding. Shadows, whispers, and inexplicable cold spots were noted in diaries and personal accounts, adding layers of dread and mystery. This introduction frames the central tension of the story: reality versus superstition, natural explanation versus the possibility of unseen forces, joy versus sudden evil. It sets the stage for a narrative where celebration and death collide, and where each subsequent investigation, recollection, and speculation pulls viewers deeper into a chilling, unresolved mystery. What truly caused Henry Caldwell's death? Was it biology, accident, or something far darker lurking beneath the veneer of festivity? This question lingers, compelling us to follow the threads of horror, psychology, and family secrets woven throughout the rest of the story. From the moment the Caldwell family arrived in Dorset in the late 1600s, their name was synonymous with wealth, influence, and an almost obsessive preoccupation with appearances. The estate itself, sprawling over hundreds of acres, symbolized not just prosperity, but a lineage steeped in privilege, secrecy, and tradition. Marble staircases glimmered in candlelight. Portraits of stern ancestors adorned every wall, and polished silverware reflected a household that prized control, order, and refinement. Yet beneath the veneer of civility, the family harbored obsessions, rivalries, and a fascination with powers beyond the rational world. Diaries, letters, and personal testimonies reveal an intricate tapestry of interpersonal tensions, jealousies, and a recurring pattern of misfortune coinciding with celebrations or major familial milestones. For generations, sudden deaths, unexplained illnesses, and strange accidents haunted the estate, often dismissed by the family as coincidence or carefully concealed from the public eye. The Caldwell legacy was therefore not only one of prominence, but also a shadowed chronicle of human frailty, obsession, and the allure of forbidden knowledge. In the months leading to Henry Caldwell's wedding in 1928, this history weighed palpably on the household. Servants spoke in hushed tones of the nervous energy that pervaded the corridors. Distant relatives arrived with cautious glances, wary of both the family's wealth and its history of inexplicable misfortune. Family diaries from the period note subtle but persistent tensions, hushed arguments over inheritance, offhand remarks about ancestral curses, and whispered speculation about rivalries simmering just below the surface. Guests recalled that even casual greetings were tinged with unease, smiles strained as though concealing worry. These observations underscore the contrast between the estate's outward charm and the inner turbulence that would soon culminate in tragedy. Psychologists might interpret these premonitory anxieties as the natural manifestation of familial stress, amplified by generations of unresolved conflict. Others suggest something more insidious, that the estate itself, shaped over centuries by the obsessions and rituals of its inhabitants, had become a vessel of accumulated tension and fear. The architecture of the Caldwell estate reflected this duality of grandeur and unease. Vaulted ceilings and sweeping hallways were designed to impress, yet secret passageways, hidden alcoves, and locked chambers hinted at a history of concealment. Servants reported odd sounds echoing through these hidden corridors, footsteps, whispers, and the occasional metallic clink of objects moved by unseen hands. While skeptics attributed these phenomena to drafts, settling beams, or overactive imagination, family legends told a different story, that the Caldwell ancestors had long practiced rites to protect the bloodline, rituals that occasionally spiraled into misfortune. Historical accounts suggest that certain rooms were deliberately sealed or locked during family gatherings, allegedly to contain spiritual energies, but more likely serving as a mechanism for controlling information, access, and power within the household. The tension between what could be empirically observed and what was whispered in folklore creates the foundation for the narrative arc of Henry's fateful wedding. Financial disputes further complicated the social environment of the family. Over decades, the Caldwell estate had grown through marriage, inheritance, and acquisition, yet wealth brought contention as much as it brought prestige. Letters from distant relatives, now preserved in local archives, document a recurring pattern of grievances, perceived favoritism toward certain heirs, secretive trusts, and subtle manipulations designed to consolidate power. These conflicts were rarely publicized. Instead, they simmered beneath a polished exterior. The psychology of entitlement, combined with fear of loss, created an environment in which suspicion and anxiety were constant companions. At times, this fear manifested as overt hostility, arguments spilling into hallways, servants overhearing heated exchanges, and at others, as subtle manipulations, cold stares, delayed communication, or exclusion from key decisions. Each interaction, minor or major, contributed to an undercurrent of dread that would climax dramatically on the day of Henry Caldwell's toast. Beyond material and interpersonal factors, the family's fascination with the esoteric played a critical role in shaping the household's culture. Documents from the early 19th century suggest that certain Caldwell ancestors practiced forms of occultism, alchemy, divination, and protective rituals intended to safeguard heirs from misfortune. Although framed as harmless superstition in some accounts, the repetition of mysterious deaths and sudden illnesses raises questions about whether these practices had unintended consequences. Diaries recount rituals performed before weddings, baptisms, and harvests, often involving cryptic symbols or the recitation of incantations. Servants, rarely participants themselves, remembered seeing candles in unusual places, witnessing clandestine meetings in locked rooms, and hearing chants in the dead of night. While some historians dismiss these accounts as exaggeration, others note the psychological impact of an environment where invisible forces were believed to be in play, a space where fear, obedience, and superstition intertwined. The intersection of power, superstition, and psychology is further exemplified in the roles of household authority figures. Matriarchs and patriarchs of the Caldwell lineage wielded absolute control over decisions affecting life, death, and reputation. In such a hierarchy, obedience was enforced not just through formal authority, but also through the implicit weight of generational expectation. Young heirs like Henry grew up under the combined influence of rigid discipline, moral instruction, and exposure to ancestral rituals. Letters from tutors and governesses remark on Henry's unusual sensitivity, noting that he often hesitated before entering rooms associated with prior tragedies or exhibited anxiety in the presence of certain family relics. This heightened awareness of risk, danger, and unseen consequences cultivated a subconscious tension that contributed to both psychological vulnerability and an intuitive apprehension of danger. In the context of his wedding, these inherited fears, layered over decades of family secrets, created a unique and precarious mental environment. one in which even a single unforeseen event could trigger panic, suspicion, or catastrophic misfortune. The interplay of human ambition and the preservation of legacy also influenced behavior. The Caldwell family prided itself on maintaining appearances, regardless of internal turmoil. Publicly, they hosted grand balls, charitable events, and social gatherings, projecting an image of unity and refinement. Privately, however, correspondence reveals an intricate web of rivalry, manipulation, and calculated intimidation. The juxtaposition of public innocence and private malevolence serves as a thematic undercurrent in the unfolding story. Observers, outside the family, from distant relatives to estate employees, frequently remarked on subtle contradictions. Smiles that did not reach the eyes, courtesy that masked condescension, and hospitality that belied tension. This contrast between outward civility and inward darkness set the stage for the fatal confluence of expectation, tradition, and unresolved psychological pressures that culminated during the wedding banquet. Another critical element shaping the family legacy is the repeated pattern of deaths coinciding with pivotal ceremonies. Births, christenings, marriages, and anniversaries frequently coincided with sudden illness or misadventure. Historical accounts record at least 4 such instances in the half-century preceding Henry's wedding. Family historians debate whether these were coincidences, the result of environmental factors, or the manifestation of psychological contagion within a high-stress household. Diaries often remark on the weight of certain rooms, where previous tragedies occurred, contributing to a kind of inherited anxiety passed down through generations. Children were taught, subtly or explicitly, to recognize danger in certain spaces or to respect unspoken prohibitions. The combination of environmental conditioning, historical trauma, and social pressure created an atmosphere in which fear and expectation were inseparable from daily life. Ultimately, the Caldwell family legacy represents a fusion of wealth, ambition, superstition, and psychological tension. It is a story of outward elegance masking inner turmoil, of traditions and rituals that simultaneously protected and imperiled heirs, and of a social environment where inherited fear compounded ordinary anxiety. Henry Caldwell's wedding, marked by the abrupt collapse during his toast, cannot be separated from this intricate web of historical context, familial obsession, and subtle psychological manipulation. By examining letters, diaries, estate records, and oral histories, a pattern emerges. One in which the line between coincidence, malice, and unseen forces is perpetually blurred. The tale of the Caldwell family legacy thus establishes the thematic and psychological foundation for the tragic events to follow, emphasizing contrasts of innocence and evil, perception and reality, and the inescapable weight of history on the present. The night of Henry Caldwell's wedding began as a tableau of perfection, a meticulously orchestrated affair designed to showcase the family's wealth, social standing, and careful attention to tradition. Guests arrived in flowing gowns and polished suits, the air filled with the scent of lilies, roses, and polished oak. The ballroom of the Caldwell estate gleamed under hundreds of flickering candles, chandeliers refracting light across gilded walls and painted ceilings depicting ancestral triumphs. From the outset, the evening was staged for delight, laughter, music, and the carefully measured cadence of polite conversation. Servants moved with quiet precision, ensuring every detail adhered to the family's exacting standards. Yet even amidst this orchestrated perfection, subtle anomalies went unnoticed by many, a shadow that lingered longer than it should, a draft of cold air in a corridor meant to be sealed, and a distant note from the orchestra that seemed slightly off in tone and timing. Eyewitness diaries provide a meticulous record of the evening's unfolding, blending observation with unease. One distant cousin, Eleanor Hawthorne, noted in her journal that the air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves breathed, and the flames of the candles danced in opposition to the slightest movement of air. Servants recalled items inexplicably moved, glasses tipped just enough to rattle without spilling, and chairs shifted subtly as though the room had a life of its own. Guests reported fleeting chills and the sensation of eyes watching from the shadows, though when turned toward, the corridors remained empty. The cumulative effect of these small disturbances created an undercurrent of tension beneath the facade of celebration, a subtle contrast between the innocence of festivity and the looming presence of malevolence. As the evening progressed, Henry Caldwell, radiant in a tailored suit, ascended to the center of the ballroom for his ceremonial toast. The orchestral strings swelled, laughter erupted, and the clinking of crystal glasses echoed against the high ceilings. Diaries recount that for a brief moment, joy seemed unassailable. Then, at the precise instant Henry raised his glass, a peculiar sequence of events unfolded. Shadows deepened unnaturally around the corners of the room, flickering against the candlelight, while a faint whisper, indiscernible yet distinctly human, threaded itself into the ambient hum of conversation. Some guests claimed they heard a voice mimic Henry's own words in a distorted echo, answering his speech before he could finish. The orchestra, though cited, appeared to play notes that were dissonant, subtly warping the melody into something both familiar and wrong. This sequence, preserved in diaries and letters, illustrates the tension between perception and reality. What appeared as a moment of joy was layered with uncanny, almost imperceptible disturbances that hinted at forces beyond reason. Psychological analysis of such high-stakes social events suggests that heightened emotional arousal can amplify perception, creating misinterpretations and even hallucinations. Guests primed by expectation and anxiety may have misread shadows, whispers, or musical irregularities, yet multiple accounts recorded independently across the ballroom converge on specific anomalies. A cold draft in a sealed room, fleeting shapes against walls, and Henry's inexplicable discomfort moments before his collapse. The consistency of these observations across varied perspectives challenges explanations rooted purely in imagination, hinting at either an extraordinarily precise psychological contagion or the influence of an unseen external force. The duality of perception versus reality, heightened by social stress, establishes a narrative contrast: innocence versus malevolence, joy versus dread. Moments before the catastrophe, Henry raised his glass in a smile, perhaps unaware of the invisible tension enveloping the room. Guests describe a brief hush, a collective anticipation, and the subtle unease that had been growing throughout the evening. Then, abruptly, Henry faltered. Diaries record that he dropped his glass mid-toast, the crystal shattering against the polished floor. His face, initially flushed with excitement, drained of color, and his movements became jerky, almost spasmodic. Witnesses described the room falling into a collective freeze, a surreal tableau where laughter, conversation, and music coalesced into a singular, terrifying moment of stasis. Panic erupted as Henry collapsed fully onto the marble floor. Guests rushed to his aid, some shouting for assistance, others retreating in fear at the sudden shift from celebration to catastrophe. The scene underscores a fundamental contrast. The public facade of control and refinement shattered instantly, revealing the fragility of human order when confronted by sudden, unexplained trauma. Servants and immediate family attempted to interpret what had occurred. Dr. Alastair Pemberton, a family physician present at the wedding, later wrote in his notes that Henry exhibited signs consistent with cardiac arrest, though no previous history suggested predisposition. Some theorized poisoning, citing the numerous elaborate dishes and beverages served, while others suggested a psychogenic collapse triggered by extreme stress, combined with familial anxiety. Yet these empirical attempts to rationalize the event conflicted with eyewitness accounts of shadows, distorted music, and the whispering voice, anomalies difficult to reconcile with purely medical or psychological explanation. Letters from Henry's bride, Margaret Caldwell, preserved in private archives, describe a sensation of watchful darkness in the room, as though the mansion itself had shifted in anticipation of disaster. As the evening devolved into chaos, a secondary layer of psychological tension emerged: mass perception under duress. Guests reported seeing figures that no one else could confirm, hearing words that defied coherent translation, and feeling a palpable force pressing upon the ballroom. Some accounts suggest that the orchestral melody continued to warp, its notes lingering beyond normal acoustics, creating an auditory mirage that heightened fear and confusion. The intersection of fear, expectation, and heightened sensory awareness may have amplified individual perception, leading to collective misinterpretation. Yet these phenomena persisted even after the event, recorded in post-wedding interviews decades later, reinforcing the notion that some aspect of the night resisted conventional explanation. The immediate aftermath was as surreal as the event itself. Henry Caldwell's death transformed the evening from celebration to tragedy, yet witnesses described a lingering auditory presence, the final strains of the orchestral melody, distorted and echoing, which became known among the family and local community as the funeral song. This melody, unattached to any living musician. Haunted survivors in dreams, letters, and later accounts, blurring the line between objective reality and the psychological imprint of trauma. Scholars analyzing the event note the phenomenon of post-traumatic auditory imagery. Yet the consistency of accounts, even decades later, challenges purely psychological interpretation. Whether this represents residual fear, inherited suggestion, or something more inexplicable remains unresolved. The events of that evening continue to influence folklore and historical interpretation. Letters, diaries, and newspaper reports published in Dorset immediately following the wedding highlight the mixture of rational and supernatural explanations. Some journalists speculated about a hereditary curse tied to the Caldwell lineage, noting the family's history of sudden deaths and mysterious accidents during major celebrations. Psychologists propose that the heightened emotional state, combined with a family environment steeped in superstition, predisposed witnesses to misperceive natural phenomena as malevolent. Meanwhile, folklorists emphasize the role of narrative and cultural memory, noting that the funeral song became a symbol of the mansion's haunted legacy. This duality, science versus superstition, perception versus reality, captures the enduring tension at the heart of the event. In conclusion, the wedding night serves as a nexus of contrasts: innocence disrupted by malevolence, celebration interrupted by sudden death, and reality distorted by perception and fear. The ballroom, meticulously prepared for joy, became a theater of chaos where human frailty, historical tension, and possibly unseen forces converged. Witness testimonies, diaries, and family letters preserve the evening's events, yet the precise cause of Henry Caldwell's death, natural, accidental, or orchestrated, remains unresolved. The night's legacy, preserved in the haunting strains of the funeral song, serves as both historical record and living legend, setting the stage for ongoing investigation, folklore, and psychological inquiry into the boundaries between human perception, inherited anxiety, and unexplained phenomena. In the hours following Henry Caldwell's sudden collapse, the Caldwell estate became a locus of urgent activity, blending grief, confusion, and meticulous scrutiny. Authorities arrived promptly, local magistrates, physicians, and constables, converging on the sprawling Dorset mansion. Yet even their measured approaches could not quell the growing sense that something about the night defied conventional explanation. The estate, normally a scene of polished order, had transformed into a theater of disturbance. Shattered glass glimmered on the marble floors, the lingering scent of spilled wine mixed with the faint tang of fear, and witnesses murmured of sounds and shadows that seemed tethered neither to the living nor the physical space. Within this landscape of uncertainty, investigators confronted a paradox: the apparent simplicity of a medical event contradicted by a proliferation of anomalies, anecdotal reports, and the palpable tension embedded in the house itself. Dr. Alistair Pemberton, the family physician, produced the first formal report. Henry's death was consistent with sudden cardiac arrest. There was no prior documented history of cardiovascular illness severe enough to precipitate such an event. Autopsy notes revealed minimal signs of trauma, yet subtle bruising on the neck and forearms confounded simple explanation. Eyewitnesses described Henry collapsing in postures that seemed unnatural, as though contorted by unseen force, and facial expressions frozen in a terror that transcended ordinary medical reactions. Servants, some of whom had served the Caldwell household for decades, reported glimpsing fleeting figures at the periphery of vision, shadows moving counter to the candlelight, and a cold draft that seemed to flow against the mansion's natural ventilation. Each testimony, when compared to others, revealed contradictions and consistencies alike. Patterns of fear amplified through social contagion, yet anchored in observable phenomena. Diaries and letters from that night provide a vivid record of the witness's psychological state. Margaret Caldwell, the bride, wrote that, "I saw Henry's eyes widen as though beholding something beyond our world. I cannot say if it was dread or if my own fear painted the scene for me." A cousin, Philip Harrow, noted that the ballroom felt wrongly shaped, shadows stretching where they should not, and the music, it did not belong to the instruments present. These accounts suggest perception under duress, the human mind's vulnerability to suggestion heightened by grief, expectation, and social pressure. Psychologists reviewing these primary sources today highlight dissociation, memory distortion, and stress-induced hallucinations as plausible explanations. Mass psychogenic effects could have created shared perceptions, where one individual's misperception propagated to others, amplified by the grandeur and formality of the gathering. Yet beyond the purely psychological, the Caldwell family's history introduced an overlay of superstition and inherited narrative. The funeral song, recorded in private journals and later published letters, had long been associated with ominous events in the lineage. Earlier accounts describe family gatherings where the melody appeared spontaneously during moments of crisis, creating an almost ritualistic linkage between music and death. Folklore historians point to ancestral practices, subtle omens, whispered incantations, and ceremonial behaviors that may have shaped collective expectation. For guests raised amidst these traditions, the night's anomalies were interpreted, not merely as coincidence but as continuity in a pattern of inherited malevolence. Shadows became spectral ancestors, whispers became portents, and Henry's collapse was read as a fulfillment of ominous familial precedent. This dynamic illustrates the interplay between memory, expectation, and cultural superstition, highlighting how inherited narratives color perception in moments of high emotion. Constables and investigators cataloged the scene with methodical precision, measuring candlelight, documenting positions of furniture, and mapping the spread of spilled liquids. Yet even empirical records could not resolve contradictions. Multiple witnesses claimed that Henry's final moments seemed to stretch beyond normal perception, with movements described as both sudden and agonizingly protracted. Servants corroborated each other in noting cold drafts and subtle repeated sounds, whispers that no human source could account for. Some observers reported feeling a presence pressing from the corners of the room, a sensation later framed in private letters as the mansion itself reacting to tragedy. These elements created a dissonance between measurable, verifiable data and subjective experience, reinforcing the tension between science and anecdotal testimony. Medical records themselves were incomplete, with gaps in observation and conflicting accounts of post-mortem signs. Minor bruising and marks inconsistent with a simple collapse raised questions among investigators. Could external interference have occurred, or did physiological reaction to stress create involuntary muscular contortions and bruising? Forensic analysis, while constrained by 1920s techniques, recognized patterns of postmortem rigidity and minor trauma, but could not definitively account for the precise expressions of terror witnesses described. When considered alongside social context, the opulence of the ballroom, familial tension, and the dramatic emotional weight of the event, these anomalies were amplified in both perception and historical record. Eyewitness interviews recorded months after the event offer additional insight into collective memory. One guest recalled seeing Henry's shadow stretch unnaturally across the room, describing a silhouette taller than himself, darker than candlelight should allow. Others reported auditory phenomena, whispers echoing in unoccupied corridors, faint strains of the orchestral melody lingering long after instruments ceased. These accounts persisted decades later, captured in letters, memoirs, and oral histories, creating a network of testimony that complicates singular explanation. Scholars note that while memory is malleable and susceptible to suggestion, the convergence of multiple independent sources describing similar anomalies suggests a pattern worth scrutiny. Psychologists examining the case point to the role of expectation, prior knowledge, and emotional investment in shaping perception. Guests aware of family history, the so-called funeral song phenomenon, previous sudden deaths, and rumored occult practices, would have been primed to interpret ordinary stimuli as sinister. Shadows became threatening. Normal creaks in the floorboards were heard as movement of a hidden figure. The phenomenon of heightened awareness under stress may have led to shared misperception, yet this does not fully account for the synchrony of anomalies across multiple independent observers. The boundary between psychological and possible external influence remains unresolved. Folklorists emphasize that the narrative of the Caldwell wedding integrates cultural myth-making and inherited expectation. Over time, accounts of shadows, whispers, and spectral figures were codified in family and regional histories, creating an enduring legend. In this light, eyewitness testimony is both a historical record and a site of interpretive construction, illustrating how fear, expectation, and cultural narrative shape collective memory. The fusion of empirical investigation with anecdotal testimony, science with superstition, underscores the dual nature of the event. It exists simultaneously as fact and as legend, resistant to resolution. The investigations concluded without definitive cause, leaving authorities, family, and observers in tension. Official reports emphasized cardiac failure, accidental or natural, but personal diaries, letters, and folkloric accounts preserve persistent contradictions. The ghostly persistence of the funeral song, recurring shadows, and inexplicable auditory phenomena ensured that the event remained haunted in memory, a story simultaneously anchored in observable events and floating in the realm of the uncanny. The night's narrative continues to illuminate human psychology, highlighting the malleability of perception, the influence of familial and cultural expectation, and the interface of fear and memory. The investigation, while thorough by contemporary standards, could not reconcile these domains, leaving unanswered questions about the intersection of trauma, inherited narrative, and possibly malevolent influence. This unresolved tension bridges historical record, psychological interpretation, and folklore, creating a rich tapestry for speculation, scholarly debate, and haunting retelling. The night Henry Caldwell's toast became a funeral song. The death of Henry Caldwell has remained a puzzle not only for historians, but also for physicians, psychologists, and folklorists. Over the decades, attempts to reconcile the empirical with the inexplicable have produced a spectrum of theories, each grounded in a distinct worldview, yet none capable of fully capturing the enigma of that fateful summer night in 1928 Dorset. Medical investigators approached the case first, seeking physiological explanations for a man collapsing in the midst of a wedding toast. Toxicologists combed through accounts of Henry's diet, medications, and exposure to environmental agents, rare allergens, undiagnosed cardiac conditions, and even foodborne toxins were proposed, yet no record conclusively confirmed a cause. The absence of overt signs of poisoning or trauma perplexed experts, who were further confounded by the subtle bruising, unusual postures, and expressions of terror described by eyewitnesses. Cardiologists theorized that a sudden arrhythmia or a latent structural heart defect might have triggered the collapse. They considered hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, long QT syndrome, and other genetic vulnerabilities, conditions capable of producing instantaneous, fatal cardiac events. Yet even within this framework, the oddities remained. Witnesses reported Henry's eyes rolling in a manner inconsistent with ordinary syncope, a momentary rigidity of muscles suggesting convulsive tension, and a pall that seemed to emanate beyond normal bodily reaction. How could a natural physiological event account for the sense of foreboding and unnatural timing that so many perceived? And how did a mundane medical incident intertwine with the reported shadows, whispers, and subtle manipulations of the ballroom environment? Psychologists emphasize the role of perception, suggestion, and social context. Weddings, especially those in wealthy, prominent families like the Caldwells, carried intense emotional weight. Anxiety, expectation, and family dynamics can amplify physiological responses, producing phenomena such as dissociation, transient psychosis, or acute stress reactions. Some scholars propose that Henry's death, while medically explainable, acted as a catalyst for collective psychological amplification. Guests, aware of the family's history of unexplained tragedies and superstition, might have interpreted ordinary sensory stimuli as preternatural. Shadows elongated by candlelight, faint echoes of the orchestra, or the subtle movement of drapery became imbued with meaning, not because of malevolent external influence, but because human cognition is primed to detect pattern and intent under duress. Yet scientific rationalization alone fails to account for a persistent theme threaded through both history and memory: the funeral song. Private journals from previous generations of Caldwell's record instances of musical accompaniment coinciding with death, sometimes hours before, sometimes after. Diaries describe a melody, a particular strain, that seems to foreshadow mortality or accompany moments of acute crisis. Folklorists argue that this is more than coincidence. Within the Caldwell household, music carried symbolic and ritual significance, intertwining with ancestral superstitions, warnings, and perhaps even deliberate manipulation. Could an instrument played with subtle intent, or a melody unconsciously echoed by collective memory, influence perception, producing the uncanny alignment between music and death reported in multiple generations? The intersection of cultural superstition and empirical investigation highlights tensions between rationalism and belief. Scholars catalog the medical evidence, yet must confront the persistent anomalies that defy categorization. Witnesses recount fleeting shadows along the edges of vision, whispers in unoccupied corridors, and movement of objects without visible cause. While psychologists might attribute these events to expectation, grief, or memory distortion, folklorists frame them as manifestations of family legacy, ancestral influence, or even malevolent intervention. The interplay of these perspectives suggests that the story cannot be contained within a single explanatory model. Science interprets data. Superstition interprets meaning. Both seek understanding, yet neither resolves the enigma entirely. Historically, the Caldwell family cultivated an environment rich in ritual, symbolism, and inherited narrative. Private letters detail not only precautions and celebrations, but also warnings, coded language about guests, events, and even music. The funeral song was sometimes referenced in letters as a melody to guard the household against untimely death, or conversely, as a means to honor ancestors. Musicologists note its structure contains motifs common in funeral rites, minor keys, and rhythms associated with tension and unease. When played during the wedding toast, intentionally or not, it may have triggered a collective psychological response. Guests, primed by familial knowledge and prior legend, could have internalized a sense of dread, heightening stress and amplifying perception of anomalies. Yet superstition is not merely an overlay on empirical reality. In some accounts, it shapes action and decision-making. Family members reportedly positioned themselves according to astrological charts, consulted fortune tellers, and interpreted signs from previous misfortunes to plan events. This attention to ritual introduces a feedback loop. Expectation of ill omen leads to heightened observation, which produces anomalous reports, which then reinforce the belief in curse or malevolent influence. In this framework, science and superstition intersect. The physiological stress response becomes intertwined with narrative interpretation, creating experiences that are simultaneously subjective and seemingly objective. Forensic historians reviewing the case note additional spatial anomalies in the Caldwell estate itself. Architectural idiosyncrasies, uneven flooring, hidden recesses, and reflective surfaces could have produced visual distortions that, when filtered through emotional stress and heightened awareness, created the impression of moving shadows or figures. Yet these structural observations do not fully resolve the persistent auditory phenomena, the lingering notes of the orchestra, reported murmurs, and echoing whispers that no musician or guest could produce. Even today, visitors to the estate report similar sensations, suggesting that the interplay of environmental cues, psychological expectation, and cultural legend continues to shape perception. In synthesizing these perspectives, the narrative of Henry Caldwell's collapse becomes an intersection of multiple explanatory domains. Scientific inquiry provides plausible, evidence-based scenarios: arrhythmia, allergic reaction, stress-induced cardiac arrest. Psychological frameworks explain perception, memory distortion, and collective phenomena. Folklore and superstition frame experience within ancestral narrative, ritual, and cultural meaning. Each lens illuminates part of the event while leaving essential mysteries unresolved. Shadows, the funeral song, and anomalous postures resist simple classification, ensuring the story retains its haunting resonance. Ultimately, Section 4 illustrates a fundamental tension: the human desire for rational explanation versus the compelling pull of narrative and superstition. Henry's death exists simultaneously as a medical event and as a story shaped by expectation, ritual, and cultural memory. Empirical data and anecdotal testimony coexist uneasily, generating a persistent ambiguity. Was the collapse a natural occurrence magnified by psychological and social factors? Or did ancestral influence, musical incantation, or malevolent design intervene? The evidence, scattered across medical reports, diaries, letters, and oral histories, leaves viewers suspended between rational understanding and the haunting suggestion of forces beyond comprehension, preserving the enigma of the funeral song for generations to come. The death of Henry Caldwell has transcended the bounds of a single historical event, evolving into a phenomenon where fact, folklore, and speculation intertwine. Over decades, the incident has drawn the attention of scholars, journalists, psychologists, and paranormal investigators alike, each offering interpretations shaped by their respective frameworks. Historians combed through letters, estate records, and personal diaries, uncovering tensions within the Caldwell family that could have motivated deliberate action. Jealousy over inheritance, rivalries between cousins, and long-standing disputes over familial authority suggest that malevolent intent cannot be dismissed outright. Some propose that Henry's demise was orchestrated through careful manipulation, a poisoned toast, subtle interference with his surroundings, or psychological coercion during a highly charged social gathering. Though tangible evidence remains elusive, these theories underscore the plausibility of human malice entwined with circumstance. Yet, the story refuses to remain grounded solely in empirical analysis. Paranormal investigators emphasize recurring phenomena within the Caldwell estate, documenting events that mirror eyewitness accounts from 1928. Instruments are reported to play without human intervention, seemingly continuing the funeral song long after the orchestra had ceased. Visitors describe hearing whispers that mimic voices recorded in diaries or transcribed from letters, and a pervasive sense of déjà vu, as if the night's events have been encoded into the estate itself, replaying subtly for those attuned to its history. Shadows flit across corridors where no human is present, and cold spots appear inexplicably in rooms untouched by drafts. These experiences, though unverifiable, reinforce the narrative of residual influence, suggesting that the estate functions not merely as a historical site, but as a repository of energy, memory, and unresolved events. The interplay between human agency and supernatural interpretation creates a rich contrast between truth and myth. Sociologists and psychologists emphasize the malleability of memory and perception, particularly in contexts laden with emotional intensity and cultural expectation. Guests attending the wedding were primed by awareness of the Caldwell family's storied past, a history peppered with sudden deaths and whispered curses. This awareness could amplify ordinary sensory experiences, transforming subtle environmental cues into phenomena that seem anomalous or even malevolent. Likewise, collective storytelling has shaped the estate's legacy. Anecdotes become embellished, interpretations shift, and ordinary events acquire symbolic weight over successive retellings. In this sense, myth is not merely a distortion of fact. It becomes an active force shaping perception, memory, and legacy. Conspiracy theories add further layers to the narrative. Some speculate that secret family pacts, predicated on safeguarding wealth or consolidating power, required the removal of potential heirs. Letters hint at cryptic instructions regarding ceremonies, guardianship, and compliance with arcane family protocols. While the authenticity of such documents is often debated, their presence underscores a human tendency to ascribe intent to otherwise inexplicable events. Could Henry have been a pawn, eliminated to fulfill obligations extending beyond the visible social sphere? Or was he an unwitting participant in rituals designed to influence fate, protection, or fortune for the broader lineage? Such conjecture illustrates the tension between rational interpretation and narrative construction. Each theory plausible within its own framework, yet resistant to definitive proof. Psychologists argue that the enduring fascination with Henry's death reflects a broader human need to impose order upon chaos. Tragedy, particularly sudden and enigmatic tragedy, challenges assumptions about safety, justice, and predictability. Theories regarding poisoning, malevolent intent, or ritualized interference allow observers to conceptualize events within moral and causal frameworks. Folkloric narratives provide alternative resolution, suggesting forces beyond human comprehension, ancestral influence, or residual energy as explanatory mechanisms. Both frameworks, empirical and mythic, function to reduce existential uncertainty. Yet their coexistence preserves ambiguity, ensuring that the story remains compelling and unresolved. Cultural transmission has amplified these layers of interpretation. Each generation of historians, writers, and commentators has re-examined the Caldwell narrative through contemporary lenses. Early 20th century accounts emphasized class, propriety, and moral failing. Mid-century analyses foregrounded psychology, stress responses, and hereditary predisposition. Recent explorations explore metaphysical dimensions, paranormal presence, and symbolic resonance. This evolution demonstrates how the passage of time transforms events into enduring narrative artifacts, blending observation with interpretation, anecdote with legend, and human agency with supernatural conjecture. As the story evolves, Henry's identity is refracted through multiple roles: victim, pawn, witness, and in some retellings, agent of unresolved forces himself. Paranormal investigations, while often dismissed by mainstream science, continue to influence the estate's contemporary reputation. Equipment designed to detect temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic anomalies, and auditory phenomena frequently registers readings consistent with reports from the original wedding. Investigators describe instruments behaving erratically, recordings capturing faint whispers resembling historical transcriptions, and environmental patterns that appear intentionally structured, as if preserving memory in physical form. Visitors also recount recurring visual phenomena, glimpses of figures in period dress, objects shifting position, and shadows that respond to presence. While interpretation remains contested, these observations reinforce the sense that the Caldwell estate is a site where temporal, psychological, and possibly metaphysical dimensions converge. The intersection of historical record, anecdotal testimony, and contemporary observation highlights the enduring tension between rationality and belief. Historians and forensic researchers provide context, documentation, and plausible explanations. Psychologists explore cognitive and emotional mechanisms that shape memory, perception, and group response. Folklorists, writers, and paranormal enthusiasts examine symbolic, cultural, and metaphysical dimensions. Each lens contributes a partial understanding while leaving essential mysteries unresolved. The story of Henry Caldwell's final toast, his collapse, and the funeral song demonstrates how layered interpretation becomes a living process, continuously reshaping legacy, perception, and experience. Ultimately, Section 5 illustrates the dual nature of enduring mystery. On one hand, it is grounded in human action, motivation, and interpretation, jealousy, family rivalry, and possible orchestration. On the other hand, it exists as a narrative shaped by cultural memory, inherited superstition, and perceptual anomaly. By juxtaposing empirical investigation, psychological theory, folklore, and modern observation, the narrative emphasizes the limits of certainty. Each retelling reshapes meaning, and each observer contributes to the persistent enigma. Henry Caldwell's death remains unresolved, simultaneously a historical incident and a living story, preserving the tension between human intent and forces beyond comprehension, between mortality and myth, between celebration and the haunting echo of a melody that refuses to fade. The story of Henry Caldwell, the groom whose toast became his funeral song, persists as a haunting enigma, defying resolution even decades after the fateful summer evening of 1928. Evidence, eyewitness testimony, and folklore collide in a manner that resists definitive explanation, leaving historians, psychologists, and paranormal researchers alike grappling with competing interpretations. Science suggests natural or circumstantial causes, cardiac arrest induced by an undiagnosed condition, an allergic reaction, or stress-triggered collapse under intense emotional and social pressure. Some medical scholars have explored the possibility of deliberate poisoning, pointing to subtle anomalies in post-mortem reports and the behavior of food and drink during the reception. These rational explanations offer plausible, measurable phenomena, yet they fail to account for the inexplicable details recorded in diaries, letters, and recollections, shadows that seem to move against logic, whispers that responded to the melody, and subtle sensations of dread reported by multiple witnesses. In contrast, superstition, folklore, and local legend suggest that the Caldwell estate itself may have been the site of forces beyond human comprehension. Accounts of ancestral rituals, family curses, and malevolent intent intertwine with the narrative, hinting at layers of meaning inaccessible to empirical observation. The funeral song is described as a melody capable of bending perception, echoing through the halls as if embedded in the very architecture of the estate. Paranormal enthusiasts continue to report instruments playing seemingly by themselves, fleeting apparitions dressed in period attire, and whispers that eerily mirror historic accounts. Such experiences underscore the persistence of narrative and perception as forces shaping reality, demonstrating how human memory, expectation, and cultural resonance conspire to transform a single event into legend. Psychologists suggest that the story functions as a mirror of human cognition, illustrating how grief, fear, and heightened emotional states can distort perception and memory. Social dynamics, collective expectation, and inherited cultural anxieties amplify ordinary occurrences into experiences that appear extraordinary, sometimes terrifying. The story also exemplifies the tension between innocence and evil, joy and terror, celebration and death. The wedding, initially a symbol of hope and future promise, became a locus for fear, misfortune, and unanswered questions, reflecting humanity's perennial struggle to reconcile chaos with meaning. Perhaps the ultimate truth of Henry Caldwell's death lies somewhere between fact and myth, existing in the interstices of memory, perception, and cultural imagination. The fragments of evidence, the whispered tales passed down through generations, and the ongoing resonance of the funeral song preserve an unresolved tension. Was his demise the result of human malice, coincidence, or forces beyond comprehension? Does some lingering presence continue to inhabit the estate's shadows, silently observing, waiting to manifest when least expected? These questions remain deliberately unanswered, ensuring that the legend endures, compelling viewers to ponder, debate, and revisit the estate in imagination, if not in person. In the end, the Caldwell wedding illustrates the power of narrative to transform a moment into enduring mystery. Celebration and death intertwined, rationality clashed with superstition, and the line between human intent and the unknown blurred. The story refuses closure, leaving an echo of the funeral song resonating in the minds of all who encounter it. A haunting reminder that some mysteries are never fully solved, and some shadows never fully dissipate.